Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Jasmine. I'm here with the Community Language Cooperative, and we're going to be providing interpretation for this event. So please bear with me while I walk through this in English and in Spanish. If you would just give me one moment. See, I'm seeing no sound. ¿Me pueden escuchar ahora? Can you all hear me now? Okay. Okay, awesome, great. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Yasmín, estoy aquí de parte de la Cooperativa de Lenguaje Comunitaria y vamos a estar proporcionando interpretación simultánea durante este evento. So if you saw in the main room, you were able to click into a Spanish channel. So if you would prefer to join the Spanish room, please feel free to do that there. Si vieron en la sala principal y quieren escuchar en español, les pedimos que por favor entren a la sala virtual principal y que seleccionen el botón verde, es una cajita verde a mano izquierda de la pantalla que dice haga clic aquí para español. So for interpretation and really our mission at the Community Language Cooperative is to provide a space of language justice, or a space where people can speak in the language of their hearts. Usually this is a language that we speak with our families, and so it's the language that we can feel best express ourselves. Para nuestra misión en la cooperativa, nosotros básicamente queremos crear espacios donde se practica la justicia del lenguaje, donde todos puedan hablar del idioma de su corazón. En otras palabras, en el que podamos hablar el lenguaje que hablamos con nuestras familias, típicamente en el que nos podemos expresar mejor. So in an effort to do this, we just ask that you please keep in mind the pace at which you're speaking. Try not to speak too quickly so that we can make sure to interpret everything correctly. If you are not speaking, we ask that you please keep your microphone on mute just to minimize any background noise. And if you do need any help or having any issues at all, please feel free to send tech support a message and they will be happy to help you. Les pedimos por favor que para la interpretación intenten no hablar demasiado rápido, intenten tomar su tiempo y solamente hable una persona a la vez. Y si no están hablando, que por favor les pedimos que mantengan su micrófono en silencio, solo para asegurar de que no haya demasiado ruido. Y si necesitan cualquier cosa, por favor también siéntanse libres de enviar un mensaje al chat a los de apoyo técnico. Se me hace que ya es todo. Cualquier cosa, ya saben dónde encontrarnos. I believe that is all, and we can go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for having us.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. So hello and welcome to the Hungry for Change Summit. My name is Kelby Johnson, and I work with the Alliance Center as a virtual event consultant. So we're just behind the scenes running this event. And today and tomorrow, we will be using this platform that you're in currently called Remo. And before we get started, I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to the platform and how it works. So if this is your first time using Remo, it is a little different from your average Zoom. I'm sure at this point people are quite familiar with video conferencing, but Remo is a little different, and in that you are able to interact and sit at virtual tables to connect with others. So you might have had a chance to check out these virtual tables before we jumped into this presentation mode. But if you haven't quite gotten the feel for it yet, we will be jumping back into those tables after this presentation for some discussion time. Now, while in this presentation mode, you are able to chat to the entire group through the general chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. You also can chat with people at the last table you visited or privately chat with other attendees one-on-one. And if you can also look on the right side, you can also see the full list of participants in this presentation mode. If at any point you need help, you can also search for myself labeled as tech support and message me directly with any questions that you have, or you can also look through the attendee list for the Hungry Free staff that is labeled as a green star next to their names, and they also can help you out. So we also will be having staff members monitoring the general chat, but if you'd like to ask any questions to the speakers, you can click on that Q&A tab that's also on the right-hand side, and you can type in your questions into that area. You also have the ability to vote on the different questions that you'd like to be addressed. So if there's a certain question that you think would be awesome to get answered by the panelists, you can upvote that, and then we'll get those passed over to the panelists. Now, after the presentations, we're going to be moving back to the virtual tables, and most are labeled with the some sponsor names, and those have information about the companies within the tables. But feel free to join. Oh, are we having some issues? Sorry, excuse me. But feel free to join any table that's available. So up to 6 people can sit at each table to network and converse, but there's 5 floors within this event, so don't worry about not being able to find a place to sit. You should be able to find a place. And to move from table to table, you just need to double click on the table you'd like to move to. And you also are able to scroll around, click and drag around the room to find other places to go. And when you're sitting at these tables, make sure to turn on your video and audio just so you're able to talk to others and converse. And these controls are found at the bottom of your screen in the footer. So also there's the ability to move to a different floor. To do so, you can click on the left side of your screen, and there's floors 1 through 5. So you can click on any floor to move to that specific floor. And if you, like Jasmine said, if you'd like to access the Spanish translated version of the event, you can click on the green button at the top left corner of the screen, and that will get you to the translated version when you're in the floor. You also will notice some other buttons around the screen that you can learn about the other sponsors through the different logos that are around the edges of the room. So if you want to learn more about the sponsors for today's event, you can click on those sponsors and learn more. And another really amazing feature is the ability to learn more about the other attendees who are participating in this event. So you can exchange virtual business cards by clicking on the small avatar within the wall on the floor. And so if you click on that, you'll be able to look at the Facebook, the LinkedIn, and the website links that people have linked into their profiles. And you can also message them privately. And just please make sure that you add your own information in by clicking on your specific avatar, and you can set up your account and add in those different links for yourself. And we also are encouraging you to put your email address in the header section of that specific avatar section, so you are able to connect via that email address after the event. We also will be using the whiteboards at each table to help facilitate your discussions. So on that bottom footer, there's also going to be controls to be able to click into the whiteboard. So that will take you into where there's the discussion questions for the day, as well as more information about other sponsors. And lastly, one last housekeeping rule, as Jasmine also stated, as in any virtual call, don't forget to mute your microphone when you're not talking, just to avoid some background noise. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or anyone else on the Hunger Free team. And we hope you enjoy the platform and have a really wonderful event. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Jacobson, the CEO of Hunger Free Colorado. Mark.
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Mark Jacobson, and I'm the CEO of Hunger Free Colorado. Thank you all so very much for joining us at our Hungry for Change, Realizing a More Just Food System Summit. This is the first morning of a 2-morning virtual summit, and we are excited about what we can learn together. Before we begin, we would like to honor and recognize the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, on whose traditional territory we reside in what is today known as Colorado. We acknowledge them as past, present, and future caretakers and stewards of this land. We also recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to these lands through trade, gathering, and healing. Further, we recognize the contributions and importance of indigenous nations and their foodways, food systems, and lands in nourishing our communities, despite ongoing threats to their cultures and the legacy of oppression and inequities that we all have a collective responsibility to recognize and dismantle. As we get started this morning, I want to offer a special thanks to our sponsors for their generous support that has allowed us to put on this free event. Most notably, our equity sponsors, the Mad Friends, BBVA Bank, and the Colorado Health Foundation. We encourage you to learn more about them and why ending hunger is a priority for them by clicking on their names on the main floor and by watching the sponsor video. We also greatly appreciate our corporate sponsors, whose names are on each of the tables. You can learn more about them by clicking on your table's whiteboard. Hunger Free Colorado connects people to food resources to meet existing needs and drives policy, systems, and social change to end hunger. We envision a Colorado in which everyone has equitable access to the nutritious food needed to thrive and reach their full potential. We firmly believe that that vision is achievable, but know that it can only happen through partnership and collaboration. In addition to working directly with the community, this past year, we partnered with more than 200 organizations, including our more than 40 SNAP Ps, partners engaging in application services who help people apply for SNAP. The 17 immigrant-centered community organizations we worked with to promote child nutrition programs. The more than 100 members of our Colorado Food Pantry Network, and the dozens of other organizations we joined forces with to advocate at the and federal levels. For many years, we have held our Hungry for Change Summit as a way to bring together many of our partners to reflect, vision, forge new relationships, and lay the groundwork for joint action towards our shared goal of ending hunger in Colorado. This year's summit continues that tradition, but it is also different in two big ways. We are, of course, holding it virtually rather than in person. This can make the networking and relationship building that has always been a core component of our summits more challenging. We hope, though, that you will take full advantage of the Remo platform to network virtually, both during breakouts, but also after today's session and before and after tomorrow's session. The other big difference this year is that we are coming together in the midst of a pandemic that has created a hunger crisis the likes of which we have never seen before in Colorado. Prior to COVID-19, the official government measure of hunger, USDA's Food Insecurity Survey, indicated that 10% of Coloradans were food insecure. Hunger Free Colorado's recent survey estimated that number at 29%, meaning that almost 1 in 3 Coloradans are worried about being able to put food on the table, with many having to cut back on food for themselves and their families because they cannot afford it. Even greater among Latinx households and households of color, with almost 40% reporting being food insecure. The pandemic has also created an incredible challenge for households with children, with more than half of parents reporting they're worried about covering expenses in the coming months. These statistics put in stark relief the reality that the pandemic has not impacted Coloradans equally. Those, myself included, who have been able to maintain their jobs and work from home have not been impacted to nearly the same degree as the millions, disproportionately Latinx and people of color, who have lost their jobs, seen their income reduced, or had to put their health at risk working on the front lines. That 1 in 3 Coloradans could virtually overnight become food insecure is an indictment of a deeply inequitable food system, one rooted in long-standing disparities around jobs, wealth, income, power, and land. These disparities are not inevitable. They are rooted in specific historical and current policies and institutional practices, many of which have been based on racist and xenophobic ideas. That the net worth of the typical white family is 10 times greater than that of a Black family, and that disparity exists at every education level, is a result of a long series of racist policies, from slavery to Jim Crow to redlining and beyond. That Latinx immigrant workers in Colorado are disproportionately represented in low-paying and less safe farm, factory, and service jobs is a direct result of federal immigration policies that constrain economic opportunities for many immigrants of color. These disparities impact the ability of families to purchase food, but they also impact the production and accessibility of culturally appropriate, nutritious food. Inequitable access to culturally appropriate nutritious food is rooted in many different types of policies. But key among those are the ways that farm and land policy have made local, healthier food more expensive and less accessible, and have hindered the ability of communities of color in both urban and rural parts of the state to produce their own food. If we are truly to end hunger in Colorado, then we must look at putting in place bold policies that can ensure that all Coloradans have equitable access to nutritious food, not just when the economy is booming, but also like now when it is not. At Hunger Free Colorado, we believe that we can make a tremendous impact on reducing hunger through strengthening and expanding access to federal nutrition programs like SNAP and school meals. But the pandemic has shown us that as an anti-hunger community, if we are serious about truly ending hunger, we also have to look at broader policy changes around boosting income, closing wealth gaps, promoting immigrant rights, and building robust local food systems. That's why we have brought together an amazing group of panelists this morning to explore these issues in more depth, help us understand what is at the root of the food insecurity we are seeing, and lay out how we can work together towards a more just food system. Our panel this morning, which I am excited to introduce, includes Lisa Durán, Executive Director of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. Lisa has worked for over 30 years in the nonprofit sector and grassroots social justice movements, fostering her strong belief that the people who are directly impacted by policies must have meaningful participation in decisions about them. Lisa helped to build the immigrant rights movement in Colorado, leading the establishment of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition and the Aurora Human Rights Center, now the Village Exchange Center in Aurora. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us. Appreciate it. Also joining us is Fatuma Imad, co-founder, executive director, and head farmer of Frontline Farming. Fatuma is an affiliate professor at Regis University and lecturer in the Masters for Environmental Studies program at CU Boulder. She is also the owner and operator of Bountiful by Design, a sustainable high-end landscape company. Fatuma currently serves as a mayor-appointed member of the Sustainable Food Policy Council for the City of Denver, is co-chair for the City of Denver's Good Food Policy Group, and is a fellow at Transformational Leaders for Change, which promotes leaders of color in Colorado. Fatuma is a 2020 Rocky Mountain Farmers Union Fellow and was elected president of Mile High Farmers this year. Fatuma was also the recipient last year of Hunger Free Colorado's inaugural Kathy Underhill Scholarship Award. Thank you so much, Fatuma, for joining us this morning. We also have with us Ashley Panelli, Associate State Director of 9 to 5 Colorado. Ashley began organizing with the Denver Democratic Socialists of America around issues such as healthcare, renters' rights, and work-family flexibility. She believes that the needs of people should be centered over profits unconditionally and prioritizes centering women and people of color in the fight for economic justice. For the past several years, Ashley's focus has been on the creation of a state-run paid family and medical leave program that will promote equity for Colorado's workers and families. She recently co-chaired the Colorado Families First campaign, that the coalition that led the successful Yes on 118 ballot measure, which will guarantee 12 weeks paid family and medical leave for more than 2.5 million Colorado workers. Congrats, Ashley, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. Moderating this morning's panel, we are pleased to have Fleurette King, Principal Consultant for Thriving Inclusion. Working for social justice and change permeates Fleurette's personal and professional life. Fleurette has demonstrated innovation and achievement in DEIJ policies since 1993, and she continues to present best practices, policies, and award-winning models at regional and national conferences. Fleurette has a master's degree in sociology from DePaul University and a bachelor's degree in sociology with a minor in ethnic studies from Bowling Green State University. Currently, Fleurette is seeking a doctorate in higher education leadership at Colorado State University. She is a recipient of the Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Inc. Sisterhood Award, the Dorothy Award, and the GLAD Award. Thank you so much, Fleurette, for joining us and for moderating the panel. And as you all can see, we have an incredible panel, and I am super excited for this conversation. Make note that integrated into this panel discussion will be an opportunity for conversation on these issues at your virtual tables, and then an opportunity for rich Q&A with panelists. So please be ready to be an active participant in our community conversation this morning. So with that, I'll invite all of our panelists and moderator to turn their videos back on, and I'll gladly hand over the virtual mic to Fleurette, and we'll see you again at the end of this morning's session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark, for getting us started. I am excited about this panel discussion. And so without further ado, maximize our time with all of you. I'm just going to start off with some questions about land, and then I want to get more into the systemic issues, policies, and procedures. So, and either one of you, anyone can jump in. What does farm labor look like here in Colorado today?
Well, I think Fatuma knows a great deal more than I do, but as I'm Lisa Durán from the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, and we do know that so many of our agricultural workers, I've seen 90% are immigrant, many are undocumented, and the immigration system, the visa system that provides the flow of labor for our food systems in Colorado, for our agricultural systems, is terribly owner biased.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
happy to jump in here. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, and I appreciate this question. I think that these times have finally allowed people to ask this question and begin to think about this conversation that's very important. In the past, we've seen that these conversations about ag workers have really not been included in food systems conversations. And so I think, you know, in the pandemic, it's forced us to recognize that these contradictions of saying that people are essential yet expendable really are not sustainable. And we see this across ag work and meat packing. And certainly we see that the harm and vulnerabilities are coming to people that very much look like me. When you see the meat packers that died in Greeley and the billboard that's gone up, all brown people. And so, you know, the landscape, I think one of the important things about this is the data itself, where it is and how it exists. And so one of our projects in our project Protect Food Systems has really been to try to track the data and get a clear picture so it's not this nebulous idea. Colorado is not California, it's not Florida. And having some account of who these people are is one beginning step, I think, in this process of recognizing and then beginning to allocate resources to them. And certainly concern about a communicable disease has raised that. So I'll start there, and there's so much to say about what it looks like. I think an important point that I would like people to leave here knowing is that while under this administration that is leaving now, we've heard a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, and it leads to the assumptions that, you know, when the borders were closed, that this happened to ag workers as well. But again, it shores up the contradiction because H-2A workers were still allowed to come over with less restrictions because we know that we need these people. So we often are creating systems that create that vulnerability and has a deep history of who's long done ag work, from slavery to bracero programs, to many of our Latinx brothers and sisters who toil hard in the fields today.
Yeah, I think The only thing I want to add to this question is just thinking through the classification of these workers. As we have conversations about worker justice and increasing rights, we're seeing also a concerted effort to misclassify workers into categories that leave them most vulnerable to exploitive practices. So we see folks classified as seasonal workers, as contract workers, and these classifications are really intentionally being put forward to essentially continue exploitative practices with impunity.
Thank you. All important points. How does Colorado use its land in the production of food?
That's an interesting question, a big question. How does Colorado use its land in the production of food? Well, I guess, it's important within this to recognize that the largest percentage of farmers in Colorado, over 80%, are small farmers on small acreage. And really, when you look at, the information about the income that's generated by farmers, we know that a significant portion of that, over 50%, I think it's like 54, make less than $2,500 in a year, and over 80% are making under that $10,000. And a small farmer is classified, according to the USDA, under 200,000, and really we're not even there yet. So we see also that smaller percentage of large farmers do hold large amounts of acreage across Colorado as well. So that's, I guess, a little bit about that in terms of like farm size, but I'm sure that question could be taken in a lot of different ways.
Sir Ashley, do you have any thoughts? If not, it's okay. I think something I think that would be interesting to think about is, especially because we are a state that where marijuana is legalized, and I wonder if that's impacting decisions with farming and how that might impact the food production as well in Colorado. But all right, so we know there are underlying issues related to all sorts of systems of oppression, racism, xenophobia, ableism, sexism, and so forth, classism, of course. How do you see that manifest in the work that you do?
Well, I'll jump in. I think, first of all, I do want to say thank you to Hunger Free Colorado for this panel and the opportunity to enter into conversation with each other across some lines that sometimes, sadly, don't get crossed. We don't get a chance to talk to each other. And you can hear in some of the deafening silence. I'm not used to being asked questions about land as someone who works in immigrant rights, but I should be. I mean, we all should be. We are all tied to the land. So, but it's been our disconnection from that land. I think that's also one of the root causes of the inequality that we see today. But so the immigration system in the United States, to speak to this broader question that you just asked, has always been about defining racial outsiders. And US economy and society was built and continues to function on the intersection of a racial and a class hierarchy. And we live in the aftermath of a settler colonial society where the main object of people coming in or invasion is to take land away for permanent settlements that need crops and cattle, as opposed to living off the edible landscape like the indigenous people did before crops and cattle came, or as opposed to, like, you know, some owner has a mine and lives in some villa in Europe while people take the goods from the land in a mine. But, you know, what's fascinating to me is that there's not agreement among ruling classes about how to accomplish the work of greed and profit, creating profit. And so you have, on the one side, you have certain interests that are looking for cheap labor. And they are at war with the people that are looking for racial purity. But those forces have gone back and forth through the centuries, literally, in the United States. Either one of those positions requires the elimination or subjugation of racial outsiders. I went through the immigration system, and I've counted 15 different congressional acts that excluded different kinds of immigrants based on their racial classifications at the time. And those policies have created inequalities that limit the opportunities for racial outsiders. And they put people who are racially outside into opportunities that pay poorly, that are physically taxing, or that are dangerous. And so that's what we see. You know, I just want to say that I do feel like food justice is an amazing, offers us amazing possibilities to re-envision the kind of communities that we want to create and that we want to live in. And I also do feel like we have to not just address structures and policies, but also the actual organizations that work for social justice, because we work in a sector, the social justice nonprofit sector, that has reproduced a hierarchical ways of decision making. And we need to re-envision our organizations so that the people who are directly impacted by policies are the ones whose voices we are hearing. And they show us, and they have meaningful decision-making roles so that they can guide our decision-making in policy.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, been here, and I think by way of answering that question, I kind of want to also take a moment and go back to your first question about what it means in terms of land. And I think there's a lot of history, and you know, that's important in understanding as we even do food work, which is so intersectional itself. Of course, you know, when history of engineers, Africans brought from Africa here to grow our food in the United States, and the history of the US itself, such a large percentage of our time since the beginning of this has really dealt with the lack of liberation and freedom for Black people in the US. So even if we think about 100 years of systematic racism, and thinking in 1920 that 14% of farm owners were Black, holding up to 15 million acres of farmland. And now in 2020, we see that less than 1% of farm owners are Black, which is even less in Colorado. And I think that what's important when we think about those things with land and food is that it's not just the value of the land as wealth itself, but the amount of money it generated in that time that was lost. This doesn't even take us to the plights of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, particularly in Colorado, and just the loss of land that was so quick, and current occupancy of Colorado really seeing over 80% of our Indigenous brothers and sisters in more urban areas. And a lot of our history here, we don't even think about the Asian communities that were here and displaced from land. In Colorado, it's important to know that Japanese Americans were specifically imprisoned or interned in Granada, Colorado in 1942 through 45. So there's that. And then, of course, the issue of what our Hispanic farmers have faced, particularly looking at like the San Luis Valley, where there was a famous case, like the Pigford case, which African Americans had recently won, that, you know, proved the major amounts of discrimination they faced. That also happened here. And a lot of that had to do with unequal access to credit after the Great Depression, and this loss of land that's not really replaceable. And so we consistently see these different institutional mechanisms that you would maybe have relied on to support or promote these people actually work against them. And so I think that Lisa's point about how we reflect on how we organize ourselves, or in terms of justice, is really important, because so many times in these conversations that are about human rights, and as a person of color, people often talk to me about the politics of possibility and what we're going to be able to do. And they're talking to me about my liberation and basic rights that should be happening. And so I think that in this path towards food work, and even in all these ways that it intersects in all of our lives, it's important to understand that there's a lot of urgency in it, and so much has happened quickly, and that stepping into those roles can be difficult and require some fight in you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, this is a loaded question because, you know, at 9 to 5, our issue area is promoting economic justice for poor and working class women of color. And, you know, when that is your issue area and you start digging into it, I can't think of a single economic justice issue that isn't disproportionately impacting women of color. I mean, in Colorado, it starts down to the very structure, the fabric of our economic structure in our tax codes, where you see that there's been an intentional effort that spans decades for, you know, white folks to be protecting themselves, white landowners and homeowners putting, you know, tax limitations on property tax and the land that they owned, and shifting that burden to people of color. I mean, there's evidence of, you know, legislators on the floor saying that directly, saying, we don't want to pay more in property tax. We are the white people, we are the landowners, and we still need revenue. So we need Black people to be paying for this revenue. How are we going to do that? We're going to impose sales taxes. So even the structure of our tax codes, it starts that cycle of economic inequality. So when you start getting into all of the details, it's pretty overwhelming to untangle all of the different intersecting ways. So when we're talking about food security, we get down a severe rabbit hole of housing security and worker justice and equal pay and childcare and transportation, and all of these things show up in our work, and it's hard to separate. It seems overwhelming, but they need to be addressed almost simultaneously.
Thank you, Ashley. So, you know, knowing that these systemic oppression exists, it feeds into food insecurities and labor issues. And now we also have a pandemic on top of this. From where you sit, you know, Hunger Free Colorado recent food security survey found that 45% of households with children were food insecure. Why do you think these households in particular have been so affected by the pandemic? So, from where you sit.
Well, you know, the restaurant, I mean, all of the industries that were impacted by the pandemic that are seen as essential workforce, they can't work remotely, and they can't. And so when restaurants and bars shut down, we know, you know, the workforce is made up of so many immigrants, and income just stopped. And of course, we also know that at the beginning, there was nothing available for people who are undocumented in terms of financial assistance. We're really grateful that the Left Behind Workers Fund was created to support workers who are not covered by federal or state benefits. But it's been horrific the way that the pandemic has impacted people's abilities to earn, and then also who is getting sick and who is dying. And it's really painful when you hear people talking about how the virus is a hoax. It's not real because they don't know anyone who has died. When your colleagues and people that I know are losing their lives as grocery workers, as restaurant workers, as construction workers, etc.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think what the pandemic has really highlighted is that these problems existed and that we did not have the infrastructure for them to begin with. They did not start with the pandemic. They have been, but now there's a spotlight on them. Prior to the pandemic, these things were true. 2/3 of low-wage workers are women of color, and 2/3 of women of color are the primary caretakers in their households. The burden of caretaking has always been on women of color, which has always been undervalued in our society. And we're seeing that even more now with the need for caring for your sick family members who are getting sick, caring for children who are not in school, and we're still not creating the support systems to address these issues. Prior to the pandemic, 1 in 4 Coloradans report themselves as rent burdened, which in Colorado, which generally that means you're paying more than 30% of your income in rent. In Colorado, that number looks more like you're paying more than 50% of your income in rent. Again, the majority of renters are women of color. So when you have paid 50% of your income, which for a Black woman in Colorado, the average income is about $37,000 a year. You're already starting with limited resources now you've had half of your income on your rent, you have 50% of that left for everything else you need in your life. So we're forcing people into these impossible choices between, do I pay my rent? Do I pay my utilities? Do I buy food for my children? Do I buy them school supplies? A number of things that, come up in life. And yeah, that's just definitely related for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to say that certainly we've known that this food system is destructive and operates on that isn't about humans, but maximization and exploitation of land and labor. And that's been the way it's been operating. And in some ways, the pandemic really just shored it up as we hit crisis. And so there's 2 things I want to address in that. Is the first is that I think the pandemic, already before it, we live in a society where we have reached over 40% food waste. That should tell us something about how our systems operate. I also think that even in the pandemic, we're seeing a lot of narratives and shoring up of myths that reinforce this destructive food system. And I think we need to start asking ourselves deeper questions about what this food we're growing is and where it's going. So when we even talked about meat packing and the executive order was issued to allow meat packing plants to continue without the businesses taking on any liability, which is a pretty crazy thing. And the narrative was that, oh, we're going to have issues with accessing meat. I'm not even going to go into that about meat in the diet or not. But I think it's important when we talk about these to recognize that these 3 biggest meat packing companies, whether it's Smithfield or JBS, are not US owned, respectively Hong Kong and Brazil owned, and massive conglomerations. So there's that. And the second part of when we're talking about production is, what is really actually producing food that feeds us, right? When we're talking about bailing out industries right now, is that actually going to food? Are we talking about grains that are feeding animals that are being exported? And so I think we need to be a little bit more rigorous about asking ourselves those food questions, because, you know, even for myself as being somebody that's worked on this, there's so much power that tries to sustain that system. And it can be scary to fight that power, but it's a real fight that you have to be in and you have to strategize around. And then lastly, I would just say that, you know, crisis, we've dealt with crisis in the US many times. And as a person of color, man, it scares me, right? I'm Arab, I'm Ethiopian. I, you know, occupy different spaces, whether it was 9/11 and the experiences we experienced of being considered non-citizens expendably, or what we saw in Hurricane Katrina. And so as a person of color, you know, it's not the hurricane that caused that destruction, but our response. And we saw so much racism that came up in that. And there's that. And what I always think about really, and I think the pandemic shores up, is how we treat poverty in the United States. Certainly, there's the racialized context of Hurricane Katrina, but also looking at how those states that were affected and didn't get responses, like Florida all the time, are some of the poorest states in our nation, and have had to do with being able to hold on to some of their own racist elements within their own, you know, independence as a state that has inherited and is still being lived out and is enforced in the structures that we live day to day in those places as people of color. And I think crisis just really articulates those things.
Thank you. I mean, so clearly we're before even COVID-19, which really just highlighted the real pandemic for people with food and housing insecurity. So there were people already living in a pandemic. And I've said this before, but I've referred to like some of the violence that people have to, and I think we have to even qualify when people have these food or housing insecurities, that is a form of violence that people are dealing with and have been dealing with even before COVID-19. Okay, so let's get into some of the structures and policies and procedures. I would love to hear from each of you. And some of you have already mentioned this. So, but if there are others of policy, procedures, or structures that you're finding problematic, and then where do you feel like we can strengthen maybe some policies, procedures, or structures to help our families manage, or people to manage better around food insecurities and so forth.
I'll jump in first. I saw Ashley, I beat you to the mute, the unmute. Do you want to go first, Ashley?
I like to build. You all help me with the ideas.
Yeah, I get that. So it continues to boggle the mind that farm workers are so unprotected in the conditions of their labor. And again, there are people on this panel who know more about this than I do, but the reason I'm speaking is because Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition has, as one of our second tier priorities, the supporting of a farm worker bill of rights. It's going to be introduced, well, that's hoped to be introduced this year in the Colorado State Legislature. And, you know, it's so important to make sure that those voices of those farm workers are centered in the creation of the legislation. And I'm so grateful to the people, the Hispanic Affairs Project, Project Protect Food Systems, Fatuma's organization, Towards Justice, Color, and I think there are others as well that I'm not aware of, but those folks are leading this. But this, you know, this idea that legislators stand on the, like what Ashley was describing, where legislators stand on the floor and actually say their interests out loud, that, you know, the humanity, the health and well-being of the people working to bring our food is not worth protecting. And that's one of the most, the profit motive is just so clear in the ways that legislators create laws. And luckily we have champions in the State House who will help us with these things, but we absolutely need to think about worker rights just in general, not just farm workers, but I believe that farm workers' rights are, I mean, farm workers as a class are so very unprotected and so vulnerable. You know, so anyways, the Farm Worker Bill of Rights is one that I'm really hoping will see the light of day this year. There are so many ways that we could do work, but I want to say that I think that policy without the voices of people directly impacted, we've seen what that does. And so we need to make sure that everything that we draft is informed by the people living the policies we're trying to change.
Thank you.
Yeah, Lisa, I think that's a point that cannot be stressed enough about having the folks who are impacted by the policies be the voice of the policy. Like, I think that, you know, I would love that to be the takeaway, you know, if nothing else, because when we see, you know, even well-meaning policy being proposed, that without those voices, I mean, we're inadvertently creating more inequity, right? When we are just not addressing those issues. And then again, from just a broader economic justice standpoint, you know, I think Colorado is unique in so many ways. I think one policy that has been just really just talked about in general is the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Colorado is the only state in the country that has TABOR, and this is directly causing economic injustice, insecurity, inequities for communities of color. We see things like in Colorado, there's a ban on rent control. We can't even have a conversation about rent stabilization to make sure that people aren't spending 50% of their income on their rent. What does it look like to overturn that? I mean, even getting a little more nuanced in the housing justice sphere, 9 to 5 will be running a bill to limit the cap on late fees that renters can get for paying rent late. I mean, we have a member who one year paid $10,000 in late fees. I mean, this is creating huge economic insecurity that's directly related to food security. So those are just a couple of the ideas that come to the forefront of my mind in terms of how we can think about this more broadly to, again, just increase economic security for the people who need that the most.
Before Fatuma, Ashley, can you say what bill that is you all are working on to limit the cap or the late fees?
There is no bill number as of yet. We will be, you know, running it at the start of the legislative session in January, but I can definitely get that information out to folks.
Thank you. Fatima?
Yeah, policy is always an interesting one. I guess my response is a little bit more philosophical and personal to say that, you know, the way that we ethically look at policy is to say to the system that exists and also has been instrumental in creating our own systems of oppression and reinforcing those. And I think that's really important to know when you engage in that work, or you'll always only be pushing so hard. And so we also like to think about what liberation means and what the new imagined world looks like. We can't necessarily posit it now, but it's important to do the work of future casting. So it's a tough space, and we think a lot about strategy and how we enter that space. And I think a big thing to recognize, whether it's in farming or this work, is that people are an asset, and how you build your networks and work with people to accomplish things matter. And then I think that it's always interesting for us being in those rooms, because we're from the very communities that are impacted. And so when we speak and we can code switch, you know, I work as a professor as well, and that allows me some access to those spaces. People will then try to divide us from the community and see us in some other way. And so we have our own struggles we deal with as POC in those rooms and how we have to affirm ourselves. And I like to think of Angela Davis's quote all the time and carry it with me, that you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. And I think that just on a strategic point, I think it's important for food movement people here listening to reflect on and think about how much food systems workers are not included in missions, analysis, metrics, and any of that. And it's long been politicized, and particularly for our undocumented people, pushed off amongst labor or federal level, and that we working in that really need to start incorporating that, not just focusing on urban farms or pantry assistance, because the same people who we're filling in through methods of activism in our communities or charity, charitable, you know, donations to make that those ends meet, are the same people who we are paying so little for the work that they do. And so that's a loop that keeps happening. Food system work. And then lastly, I just want to say, I think it's important to have guiding principles that you hold on to. And so for us at Project Protect, you know, we're very clear that this model is essential and not expendable is important for us to continually articulate, that we know there is no justice without security, that protection of workers and environment is just good business, that people should have equity in risk and opportunity. We take solace in calling these people frontline workers and heroes, but what does that do for them? And that, you know, we should really focus on our principles of being land-based and people-based. And lastly, that some of us have roles to elevate and amplify the voices of these people and their dignity who work so hard to sustain us.
Thank you. Good. I hope people are taking good notes, because I feel like you've all three of you have given some good direction and insight as to where people can put their time, energy, and resources. But I want to ask, anyway, in case there's some additional things you would like to share, what are some practical things that the attendees today can do to make an impact on some of the issues talked about today?
You know, I think one of the easiest things to do is to connect with the panelists, get involved in our organizations, get on our email lists, figure out what direction we're headed. I know that there are definitely places to plug in and support. You know, definitely, I can't stress enough how money goes quite a long way in these fights. Donating to POC-led organizations. POC-led organizations are about 10 times less funded than white-led organizations. Doing this work does take quite a bit of labor and monetary resources. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go, Lisa. Yeah, so I think the important thing to recognize is that, you know, this work is very urgent and has been for many of us. And there are many tolls it takes for communities working on that, and have different forms of knowledge and compensate it. Who we see as knowledge holders is an important thing to really interrogate on a deeper philosophical level. Like my mother being an immigrant, coming here and always, you know, being told knowledge is you going to community college, knowledge is you doing this path or that, when it's like, man, my mom knows so many things, and it's the kinds of things that we need for our futures. And so how we honor different forms of knowledge, and just recognizing that in crisis, it's an opportunity as well bad ideas to come to fore. And there's so many good ideas that exist. We're not reinventing the wheel. We should build on the work of our ancestors and so many people who have struggled before us and given so many good ideas. And to know that in these times, and as Winona LaDuke says, we spend as POC over 80% of our time fighting off bad ideas. Look at what they try to do on Indigenous lands. It's crazy. And so just knowing that there are a lot of good ideas out there and that it takes all of us as people are assets to push, and that this is urgent.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ashley and Fatuma. And, you know, and I think what I would add is comes directly from my own history. I've been organizing in community since the 70s, and I burned out a number of times because I produced my justice work like a capitalist produces a product. You know, there's this thing about work ethic, and there's this thing about how we're supposed to be busy and producing all the time, and did we get our outcomes? And of course, philanthropy, of course, reproduces that. So I say this because the people who are here, so one of the things that I think is so problematic about justice work is that we can think that because we're learning about struggles, that's enough. But I can impact what I can impact. I have a reach, and it is not, I am not in Afghanistan. I am not even across the street sometimes. I have my own network and my own history, right? And I need to bring that to bear. But if I am not looking at myself in the work, and if I'm not looking at the kind of organization that I am creating, then I'm going to go ahead and reproduce the inequalities and the hierarchies that have created the horrible inequality that we see around us today. And it means that when we see that we are not in touch with people who are experiencing oppression, it doesn't mean that we go over there and tell them we know what they need to do. It means we lead by stepping back, shutting our mouths, and listening within our own organizations and outside of our own organizations. And so, you know, this is really hard. I'm a light-skinned Mexican, so I have a lot of skin privilege. I had to come to terms with what that means in a racialized society. Mm-hmm. And I had to own that grief because it wanted to separate me from my own family. And, you know, punishing speaking Spanish, my mother and her father could no longer speak at the end of his life because he didn't learn English and she lost her Spanish for being punished for speaking it. So, you know, if we don't own those we have to do this work in our bodies, not just in our heads. We have to be integral. I hope this makes sense. I never used to talk like this because I used to be always about, we're going to win and this is the power and we're getting the, you know, the forces together and I've got the analysis of capitalism down, you know, and that is true. It has to, yes, that's in there. That's it. That's part of me. But if I am not owning who I am in this world and creating the communities that help us to be in real connection with each other. If we were in real connection with each other, all of us, no one would starve because we wouldn't let it happen. No. But we're not. So I'm going to stop there because this is huge. I mean, you know, I burned out, had to leave to be able to come to these recognitions. But I do think that they are, together with what has already been said, I think they're also important.
Thank you. I know we need to close this out. I'm hearing some noises and perks and chirps. I don't know where they're coming from, but I do want to just, before we're going to go into the breakout rooms, allow them to discuss what you all have shared with us today. Is there anything else you want to say before we give that breakout, do the breakout rooms, and then of course we'll come back for Q&A. Is there anything else you would like to say before we make that departure? Okay. Ashley, you okay? Okay. I mean, I hope y'all folks are taking some good notes, because this is an astute, amazing panel. And so we are going to seek, we already got a couple of questions that we will start with, I believe, when we get back. But I'm not sure who's taking folks into the breakout room, but I just want to thank our panelists for this part so far. It was amazing to hear your perspectives. I feel like just really clear about what needs to happen, what the situation is, and how everyone can find a way to get involved or to help eradicate the underlying issues around food security. We either could decide that we just want to be a charitable situation, or that we actually want to seek real justice and actually deal with the underlying issues. And so I appreciate everything that the panelists have said so far. So I guess we're prepared to go